On this edition of the Sky News Daily, some of the stories which defined 2022 and the way in which they might shape our lives in future. Over 5 special episodes, we will be covering politics, the economy, the royal family, climate change, but on this one, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese president's grip on power, and of course, the struggle for freedom around the world. As you can tell if you are watching, sitting across from me, our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. And Dominic, 2022, a year to remember, a year to forget in so many ways. I suspect you've been racking up the air miles.
Yeah, I've travelled more this year than I've ever travelled before. I was way more than I've been at home. So it's been an extraordinary year and pretty sinister at times and deeply worrying. And I think we'll look back on this year as the year that changed everything. Probably the most transformational year or consequential year arguably since the Second World War, because it's a year, it's not just a Ukraine war, but obviously, NATO effectively is fighting a war with Russia with everything but troops. And obviously it's not over yet. And the consequences, the implications of that are enormous for the future, however it ends up. But I think it's what's happening in China as well, and between China and America, that has huge implications. You now have in China a kind of new emperor, Xi Jinping, who is confirmed now for a third term, an unprecedented third term in office. He's a man with a vision, and he sees China's destiny as taking over the world effectively, or taking up its natural place, he thinks, as a kind of superpower leading the world. And so the battle lines are drawn between the West. They're being fought over in Ukraine, but also diplomatically and geopolitically between the West and China, and that has huge consequences for the future. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary year.
It will be fascinating to see what comes next. But let's start by reflecting on 2022 and, of course, one of the biggest stories of the year, that conflict, that war. Let's call it what it is, not a special military operation between Russia and Ukraine. From where we started the year to where we ended, I mean, just give us an idea of the dynamics that we have seen in this conflict over the past 12 months.
Well, it started from a point of complete surprise, really. I left my home at 6 in the morning to go to Moscow, not expecting the war to happen. And I was like many people saying, all the Russian analysts I spoke to said there's no way that Putin will launch this war. It would be mad for him to do so. Genuinely,
because I have to ask you on that, because it's difficult. I almost forgot that the war started, within the past 12 months. But were people genuinely shocked at this, given the huge build-up that there was on the borders of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, exactly. There were tens of thousands of Russian troops. But every Russian analyst you spoke to said it would be mad for him to invade. A few said he might, but if he does, it'll be over in a week or two. It'll have to be, because otherwise he'll fall from power. So all their predictions have not come true. And the people who did get it right were the military and the intelligence agencies and journalists working close with them, because particularly when they started seeing blood stocks being sent to these thousands of troops, they thought, it's got to be imminent. But there was a real sense of shock when it happened. And within, I think, the first sort of week or so, when I was in Moscow after the invasion started, I interviewed Andrei Kortunov, who is a foreign policy analyst, very close to the Kremlin, kind of a foreign policy advisor to the Kremlin. And he was in a deep sense of shock. He said, because he talked for a while in sort of foreign policy, very dry geopolitical analysis. But I said, that's you, the analyst, but as a human being, how do you feel? And the mask slipped, and he said, I'm just so depressed. I didn't think this would happen. I'm depressed. Everyone around me is depressed. There should be people in the Kremlin depressed as well. So for him, it came as a complete surprise, because it just didn't make sense geopolitically for Vladimir Putin to do this. But obviously, he was operating under a different rationale to what we thought he was.
Well, look, I think the one thing we can say is that it has not gone as Vladimir Putin intended.
No, absolutely, yeah. I think he was under the impression that it would be over fairly quickly, that a sort of lightning blitzkrieg operation would take Kiev using paratroopers and sort of a lightning armoured strike.
Underestimated the Ukrainians, didn't they?
He did, and I think he underestimated that, but also the support the West would give the Ukrainians. There was a fair amount of special forces, I think, support for the Ukrainians as well going on there. But yeah, what he expected and what he was advised by his intelligence agencies was that a lot of Ukrainians would come out and welcome them as liberators, and that his forces would fight more effectively than they have. And you have to bear in mind that he has spent a lot of money on his military, but a lot of that's gone into the back pockets of the sort of military oligarchs, if you like, around him. So they've had to say to him, this money you're spending is money well spent. not telling them they're spending the money on their villas in France or their yachts or whatever. So at the beginning, they were saying also all the way through, it's going well. The military is performing as we said it would. But obviously the contrary was true. And so the attempt to decapitate the Ukrainian regime failed, and now we're stuck into, they've had to pull back from Kiev, we're stuck into this kind of artillery war, which is devastating in the east, and a gradual process of the Russians retreating in the face of this determined, spirited onslaught by the Ukrainians.
And we have seen a number of atrocities. There has been an awful lot of bloodshed on Ukraine's soil.
There has, and there's been, as you say, atrocities committed on both sides. Reportedly, Ukrainians are thought to have executed a few people, a few Russians summarily, but most of them carried out by the Russians, and horrendous atrocities in Bucha, to the north of Kiev, but rapes, mass graves found, and rape being used as a weapon of war. We've heard most recently from President Zelensky's wife, the First Lady of Ukraine. So there's a sense that Russians are using this deliberately to intimidate the enemy, or have been, but also a sense of a lack of command and control, a lack of breakdown of discipline, and complete disarray and chaos in the Russian ranks. So much so that the Russian rank and file have been so frustrated by their commanders at times they've taken things into their own hands, and at one point, remember, a Russian commander was run over by the tank of some of his own troops. So that disarray has been the kind of hallmark, the characteristic of the Russian military operation, until General Armageddon, Surovikin, was appointed. And he's brought a new sense of discipline and order and a better sort of military logic, which means we're now seeing the Russians holding the line, and more of a stalemate emerging north of Crimea and in the east.
Some people had predicted that the sanctions would see the Russians kind of change tack. That hasn't happened. The Russian economy hasn't completely evaporated. Their central bank has done some decent work, but there has been one significant consequence of this conflict, of course, which is the global impact in terms of prices, and not just of course in terms of energy.
Yeah, I mean the grains situation. We went to Odessa on the docks of Odessa. There were, I think it was 250,000 tons of grain. There was a ship that hadn't left harbour, which was due to was bound for Egypt, and it had in it enough grain, we worked out, to feed 300,000 Egyptians for a year.
Wow.
So that was a huge amount of grain trapped there. Now that grain's getting out, but the economic impact has been, as you say, it's globally been felt, and it's been devastating. It's led to inflation, fuel prices going up. It's destabilised the whole global economy. If it goes on for another year, the estimates are somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $3 trillion it's going to cost the world economy. So it's been devastating for the world, but also devastating for Russia and Ukraine, obviously. A huge amount of civilian infrastructure destroyed in Ukraine. And on the Russian side, a massive brain drain, and a sense that the regime is safe for now, is intact, that has control, but there is manoeuvring going on in the Kremlin. There is a sense, I think, that Putin's not, his position isn't secure forever, and he can't do this indefinitely. So that raises, I think, questions for next year.
What about questions about NATO's status in all of this? I mean, has it truly been strengthened? Yet we have seen countries acting in concert. I mean, who knows where the Ukrainian conflict would be right now if NATO countries had not provided material in the way in which they had. But I do wonder, Crimea was in 2014, This was a problem that some analysts presumably did see coming at some point. NATO hasn't proved to be the bulwark against kind of Russian expansionism that it was supposed to be.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean,
Sure.
yeah,
I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here.
Absolutely, but bear in mind that for 6 years, since Trump's election, we have been fretting over the state of the Western alliance, of the post-war world order, because Trump had no faith in it and was impatient with it and thought the idea of multilateral organisations was something he had no time for. And there was a sense that the disunity, but also the divisions in the alliance meant that it was on borrowed time, but it's risen to the challenge, the biggest challenge it's faced since the Second World War, coming up with a united position on sanctions, on action against Russia. And that failed to deter Putin. And it's managed to continue keeping that solidarity and unity together during the war, supporting Ukraine. So, the Western alliance has held up reasonably well in terms of solidarity and unity, but it hasn't worked. It has not stopped the Russian invasion. And we now face a kind of logistical problem, which is Ukraine is using up Western-supplied munitions so fast that actually the West is not producing them fast enough to keep up. And we're seeing a kind of arms race between Russia desperately trying to use its industry to create enough weapons to fire at the Ukrainians and vice versa. So yes, stresses and strains. But yeah, I mean, it was an intelligence failure in the sense that it wasn't prepared for enough, it wasn't seen coming. But actually, I think diplomatically, the alliance has done better than was expected.
Simple question, but I suspect with a rather complicated answer. Do you think we will actually get an end to the conflict in 2023?
I mean, I think the dangerous thing for people like me and you to sit in studios. I mean, if you look back a year ago, anybody sit in the studio, they would not have predicted sustained unrest on the streets of Tehran. They wouldn't have predicted the biggest unrest in China for 30 years since Tiananmen Square. They wouldn't have predicted. We've got used to this war, but there's no way a year ago we would have thought the war could have carried on and killed tens of thousands of people and Putin still be in power. So it's a fool's errand, isn't it? I think what we can say, we can look out for certain things, and I think with the Ukraine war, Putin's best chance of not losing is dividing Europe. It's going to be a very tough winter for the Ukrainians, but also for Europe. And those divisions, that disunity in Europe is already like under enormous pressure. So countries like Italy, who are economically going to be most affected by the war, I think, we might see them break ranks and pushing for negotiations. Ukraine's position and the British government's is that any concessions to Putin will just give him more of a foothold to continue his action later on. It needs to be beaten. He needs to be beaten decisively. So he can try and divide the allies. I think the other thing to look for is what's happening in the Kremlin, because he looks secure in power, but we are seeing various people around him manoeuvring, like Prigozhin, Putin's chef, his nickname is. He runs and controls the Wagner group. We've seen people like him manoeuvring a bit, and I think we might see more of that. So watch out what's happening with Europe, but also what's happening in the Kremlin.
And of course that relationship with China. But let's focus on China itself, though, and its President Xi getting a third term. I mean, he is now essentially, president in perpetuity, isn't he?
He is. He's effectively the emperor. And it's interesting because you've got him in China and you've got Putin in Russia, who's effectively a kind of czar for the 21st century, going back to sort of an old form, an old model of rule. Xi Jinping is, ever since Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, you've had a Chinese leader that's given up after 2 terms, and that's allowed the Chinese leadership to kind of renew itself and learn from the past and be more pragmatic. Now he's very different. He's now entrenched in power. He sees the destiny of China. He saw Mao as the man who united China under the communists. Deng Xiaoping made it richer again, and he's the man who's going to take it to its destiny, which is effectively a superpower, leading the world and reforming the world order in China's image. So basically on a more autocratic lines, and that is a direct threat to the West. So he wants to establish the world in a very Chinese way to be autocratic, and the West is pushing for continuing the sort of liberal values that it's operated on under the Second World War. So that's a massive, titanic struggle for the future.
It is, particularly when you have such a dissatisfied populace and a huge populace that could well turn. I mean, in terms of the COVID restrictions, because that we suspect is is the root cause for much of the outbreak of protests, the fact that they have had to step away from their zero COVID policy doesn't scream that they're in complete control.
No, it doesn't, and they are under pressure from that. And I think that the danger for them is that they are going to have to lift the pressure cooker lid a bit, because it's led to the biggest unrest we've seen for 30 years. For that to happen when I was there in 2004 to 6 was unheard of. I'm talking to Tom Cheshire, who's just left, who's, he obviously, very frustrated for him, he didn't see this, but for 30 years we've not seen Chinese come out on the streets and demand Xi Jinping to stand down. It's unheard of. So it's led to massive pressure for change. That could lead to a relaxation of COVID rules. That could then lead to more infections. It inevitably will, because they've been told by the government you don't need to get a vaccine, or its secondary importance, because we've got this under control, particularly the older people. So if it leads to a massive COVID spike in COVID infections, that could lead to more unrest, and I think that will be a challenge to the Chinese government.
Are we seeing, however, the West perhaps starting to be slightly more bullish towards China, towards Xi? I mean, I think of Rishi Sunak identifying China as perhaps the biggest problem we're going to have to deal with in 2023.
Yes, it's fine. I think the West has finally worked out that the idea that we sort of left the Cold War with, which was that the battle of ideas had been won, and that the way forward for any country was to be more capitalist, to be more free, more democratic, and it was only a matter of time before countries like China would follow the Western path. That has deluded Western leaders, for decades, and it's clearly not the way China is heading. And so that penny's dropped. The idea of George Osborne talking about this sort of golden era between British-Chinese relations. That looks very naive.
Yeah,
now,
we're away from that now, aren't
We've
we?
moved on from that, yeah. So and what we're seeing now is a conscious uncoupling, which is a rather sort of clunky phrase, but it's what economists use to describe what America and China are doing, which is China's becoming more self-sufficient. America trying to build its own semiconductor industry, for instance, placing sanctions on Chinese technology. It's a natural, I think, outcome of the COVID pandemic as well, where we realised that these long thousands of miles supply chains can't be relied on anymore. And it's a new order. It's, what we had in the past is a virtuous cycle of China lending to America, the Chinese consumers buying Chinese stuff, and that was helping fuel the Chinese economic transformation. That's gone now, and it's a very different future, and it's problematic if it's not managed very carefully, because if you have that kind of division, there's more room for misunderstanding, there's more room for confrontation, particularly over Taiwan.
Well, we will see in 2023. Dom, you just take a breather just for a second. After the break, we will be turning our attention to Iran and, of course, the death of Mahsa Amini. Welcome back to the special edition of the Sky News Daily. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, still here taking us through his choice of the stories from the preceding 12 months. And we have to talk about Iran, don't we, Dom? Because we were saying about China just before the break that the unprecedented scenes of dissent, similar in Iran. Explain how we got to that point.
Well, it's been building up for a long while, and the regime has become more and more discredited because it's not delivering what the Iranians want economically, and they have felt more and more repressed by it. And it's a theocratic regime that goes back to 1979. And the Iranians kind of feel the world is leaving them behind. But the spark was this death of Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish woman who was taken in to custody by the morality police, the guidance patrol, I think it's called, because she wasn't wearing a hijab, a headscarf. You go to Iran, all women have to wear them. Some of them flout the rules by wearing a very little bit of cloth just at the back of their heads, you can see. So there's that kind of symbolic protest. But if you don't wear it, you can get taken. And she was taken to custody, and she was so badly beaten, she died in custody. And that was the spark, and it led to these uprisings and protests.
Across the country. Across the country, we should say. It wasn't just localised in Tehran or something like that.
The big difference between the unrest now and what we've seen in the past is it's been localised in the past. This time it's united the Shia, the Kurds, just ordinary Iranians. But the big difference really is that it's been led by the women, and that's sort of across the nation, and it's not going away. And the regime has used everything they can. Normally they use brute force to go out and shoot people, and they also take people in, and they also threaten their families, which can be very effective in stopping young people protesting. Something
we've covered on the Daily. We, with a couple of members of our forensics and data team, looked at someone being shot dead on the street for no apparent reason. And the further we dug into it, there genuinely was none, bar striking fear into the heart of ordinary Iranians.
Yeah, it's a very, very brutal regime, and the problem for them is that it's not working this time around. So they're kind of scratching their heads saying, well, we're shooting them, we're taking them, and we're pulling them, that we're threatening their family.
Executing them now as well.
And exactly, they're now executing. So they are keeping this hard line, but whatever they do, it's not deterring the process. So if you talk to some Western diplomats who know Iran well, they say the regime is finished. It's just a matter of time. It could be weeks, months, even years. But others,
years doesn't sound finished to me.
Well, it's on borrowed time, they would say. But yeah, others would say, well, look, if you look at the Maduro regime, they kind of set the model, which actually they kind of learnt for the Iranians as well. But basically, if you have a security apparatus that you support and you fund and you cost, and you feel that their lot is in with yours, then you can last indefinitely. So I think, but it's a great question of our time, really. I think is can these forces, popular forces, prevail against these repressive governments run by corrupt old men? I think the problem for the Iranian government is it's not going away, but it doesn't have a leadership. It doesn't have a sort of focus the protest, which is a strength and a weakness. So at the moment, it's a kind of stalemate, but it's ongoing.
I suspect then, looking ahead to 2023, dissent and the way in which it might arise and the way in which it might be suppressed is something you'll be keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, because 2022 has been, as we were saying, it's been setting the East and the West against each other, a chasm opening up between the East and the West, and it's really been the story of autocracy against democracy, and that's been at a geopolitical level, leaders against leaders, but also on the street. So the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians when they are able to come out and protest, demanding more freedom and more democracy. And arrayed against that is technology that the Chinese in particular are developing. For instance, if you go to Shanghai and you cross the street on a red crossing, your face will get recognised with facial recognition technology, and you will automatically be fined on your WeChat bank account or whatever.
Really?
Yeah. So you don't even need to know it.
Oh dear, right. And I suspect it gets rather more insidious than that.
Yeah, so that's the kind of power you have. So you can imagine then you can use that technology against the masses. So people who took part in those protests have had phone calls or texts saying, we know you were there. Do you want to lose the following things? Think twice about it. So if you have that control, ultimately, you kind of wonder whether in the end these autocracies will be able to stay in power indefinitely. So I think one of the questions for 2023 and beyond is, has technology rendered dissent and unrest and opposition obsolete? Is there nothing you can do eventually, ultimately, if you're a young Iranian, Russian or Chinese person, if you're against that kind of Orwellian control? Or actually, can they find ways around it? And the Chinese protesters have been very resourceful in getting around online censorship. And they've found a way of organising nationally, despite this Orwellian control system that the Chinese spent billions on. So I think it's not a foregone conclusion, and I think it's one of the questions of our great questions of our time is, can that technology be overturned, or does it mean that these corrupt old men are in power indefinitely?
I suspect it depends a little bit on which men are running those technology firms as much as the people who are on the ground. Dom, it's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you. What a year 2022 was. Thank you very much for your time. And that is everything from this special edition of the Sky News Daily. Many of the topics that we have covered you will find on the Daily itself. Just go and have a search for Sky News Daily, wherever you find your podcast. We'll see you next time.